Welcome back, everyone, to the Art Fisher podcast. Super excited today to be discussing a movie that came out a couple years ago. But before we get into that, we have a lovely guest on today. Who's our guest today? You want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name's Cody. I'm here to talk about Godzilla Minus Zero.
Perfect. A man who needs no introduction, Cody Cooper, the legend himself. Is it minus one or minus zero?
Minus one.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure because I thought I was misremembering it for a second.
No,
I
I
mean
don't
minus.
mess that up because the zeros are the kamikaze fighters.
Yeah, I was gonna say minus zero might make more sense as the title, but we'll get into that. So to um to introduce this, got a couple things here. We talked off air about the budget, which is allegedly between 10 to 15 million dollars. Which, to be clear, for a movie that came out in 2023, that is like peanuts. That is hardly anything. Especially for a Godzilla movie, a Gojira movie that, I mean, you want to talk about just like burning cash on CGI or different sets or blowing things up like that all costs sweet money. Um, but anyway, this movie in particular, you were the one that recommended it to me, so very thankful that you did. I've seen a number of Godzilla movies, but have not seen one like this. So just want to kind of give some groundwork for this and some of the iterations of Godzilla that came before. So Godzilla, the original Godzilla, I believe came out in 1954, and this movie is largely paying homage in a lot of ways while still doing its own thing. So I'm just gonna explain some of the things that are kind of an homage in a way. So Godzilla's roar in this movie is actually the original roar from the 1954 film. The story itself is wholly original, while obviously including Godzilla. The rampage of Godzilla in this one is very similar to its first appearance in the 1954 film. Odo Island is a callback to the OG Godzilla. The music from Godzilla movies are also remixed in this one. Koichi Shikishima. Koichi was that's the main character's name, by the way. Koichi was the special effects coordinator of Godzilla movies from 1985 to 95, and Shikishima was the name of the first kamikaze squadron to carry out a massive air attack, which sank the USS St. Louis in 1944. I'm not gonna go into too much more detail, honestly, because it gets into like a little bit more of the nitty gritty details here. But the last thing that I wanted to say is every warship that is included in Godzilla Minus One is a real vessel. And this shows Takashi Yamazaki, the director's passion for World War II history. And it does make sense because before this movie, he directed films such as The Great War of Archimedes and The Eternal Zero. So, after laying like all of that groundwork, Cody, since not that this is your necessarily movie, but
I'll take ownership of it gladly.
what why in particular is this a movie that you want to discuss?
Yeah, I guess I can start with like why I decided to watch it in the first place, and then talk about why I wanted to discuss it. But like, I've watched some Godzilla movies in the past. I wouldn't say like I'm a massive fan of Godzilla or anything, but I'm also like down to check it out. Saw the Bryan Cranston one, the '99. I've seen a few of the OGs like Japanese that were dubbed. just kind of here and there, check some out. But yeah, I wouldn't consider myself a massive fan, but whenever I was working in Albany, I was working with a guy who was like the fan as far as I'm concerned. He'd watched every single one. I mean, he could talk about like the evolution of Godzilla, kind of the themes, just how it evolved over time from 1954 to present day. He had opinions on every single one. He said he would watch it with his dad. And so I remember just, picking his brain about Godzilla movies. And then he said, like, have you seen Godzilla Minus One? And I was like, no, like, what makes it special? And he just said, dude, you got to go check it out. Like, I don't really want to tell you, but like, go check it out in theaters. And so I was like initially a little hesitant because I'm like, oh, it's a Godzilla movie. What more can it say about the genre? And my God, like this movie is like a thriller start to finish. But I remember, just before checking it out, like looking up like brief reviews online. And I think everyone that watches this movie can agree. I mean, it opens it out. Movie opens on an island, but that's the opening scene, like a Godzilla attack. But I think what really draws people in is whenever the main character Shikishima returns. So the island attack, he's a kamikaze pilot, lands on like I forget the name of the island, but
Odo Island.
Odo Island, lands on Odo Island and says that he has mechanical failures. Said there's a group of mechanics on the island. They check out his airplane and they say there's really nothing. There's nothing wrong with it, which tells you from the start Shikishima is not willing to, commit kamikaze. He's not willing to die for the cause. But what really gets you hooked, I think everyone that's seen this movie, is whenever he returns home, he's disgraced. He's in town in Tokyo, which has survived the fire raids. Well, somewhat survived. His parents died. Everyone's died, minus one of his neighbors, Sumiko. So he shows up. She says, "I thought you were a kamikaze pilot. How did you survive?" And then she starts hitting him and blaming him for the loss, and how people like him lost World War II. If they would have made the ultimate sacrifice, then in Sumiko's instance, her children would not have died. And so, like right there, you get the emotional weight of it. But I think what really, really draws people in is he's then standing in a market getting rations. All of a sudden, this woman runs by. The police are chasing her. They're yelling at her to stop. Shikishima gets in the way, and then she hands him like what looks like a bundle of blankets, and then it turns out it's a baby. Once I saw that, I was like, yeah, I'm in. Like, this is all within the first 15 minutes, but once you meet the baby, Akiko, like you are all in. And I think what the guy I was talking about in Albany said that really made me want to check out the movie is he's like, obviously, like I'm a massive Godzilla fan, but if this movie didn't have Godzilla in it, I still would have loved it. And I think that's a testament to the characterization. I mean, you've got Shikishima, you got Sumiko, like you've got Akiko, Noriko, like all these different characters, and you care about every single one of them for various reasons. I mean, there's heavy thematics on PTSD, nuclear weapons, which we can get into later. But I think at its core, why I like the movie, why I will heavily recommend it, is it is the best Godzilla movie I've ever seen. And if Godzilla wasn't in it, I would still highly recommend it.
Yeah, I could not agree more. That was a way better intro than I think either of us could have done, and I'm really excited to have you on because that was great groundwork. I believe when you recommended it to me, you mentioned something. You didn't say like as much in as many words, but you said something about like the human aspect of the movie like really comes through, and I think that's like a continual thing that we're gonna come back to, a continual aspect of this movie. That was actually going to be one of my like overarching points, is that if you do remove the monster from the movie itself, um, the story does not change as much because humanity is at the focal point, which I think, excuse me, does differ this movie from a lot of the iterations that came before, where the wires can get kind of crossed at times with what the point is, or it's simply just like, you know, humans versus this terrible element. But there's a lot of stuff that's going on in the backdrop in this movie, and like layered upon um the monster aspect, that I think really pushes forward the story, but also that human element. Because, like you said, within the literally the first 3 minutes, it's established that this guy is a coward and can't take his own life. Which in like I say that like not accusing him, but more like from the mindset of Japanese culture
Bushido culture.
yeah, of you, like you are one, a part of like in union with like your countrymen. And as you said, like he shows back up and he is blamed for like the loss. And obviously, like the audience, it doesn't take much for the audience to just be like, all right, well, if he killed himself, like that would not have solved things.
Yeah.
Like they don't have to say that for you to understand it, but you understand that. And also, nobody is blaming him for not like kamikazing, right? Um, so I think that that works in a lot of different ways to really draw you in, like you said, and you instantly feel connection with this guy. Because, I mean, no one wants to get into a plane and sacrifice themselves, which becomes a larger element
Yeah.
in the story later on, which I think is really incredible that they assert this right out of the gates, and then they build that up to pay off.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. So I would say like that first scene where they're on Odo Island with the mechanics, and they tell Shikishima like, yo, dude, your plane was fine. You have one mechanic that kind of seeks him out on the side, and he says, and I thought this was like kind of the central idea of the movie, like the question that they're all considering, but he asks him, why obey an order when the outcome is clear?
mm,
Like why crash into a US naval ship when we're going to lose? Like what is that sacrifice worth? And I thought that was like the central idea of the movie, especially on the second rewatch. I saw that line and was just like, all right, that like from the very beginning, it's got you asking, like, is this a sacrifice worth it? When is a sacrifice worth it? Is it ever worth it?
definitely. Yeah, I could not agree more.
Yeah, and I answers the question that like the sort of spirit of Bushido and the spirit of a lot of like Japanese cultural war tactics, like there's some truth to it, that there is a worthy sacrifice somewhere, not
Yeah.
because, you know, life is meaningless and therefore in death you're just fulfilling the sort of natural state of life, but that war is inevitable. Like there's a constant mention of like, you know, the Cold War era that would follow the World War II era, where like war is happening anyway, and Japan is going to have to deal with it. And so, you know, to sort of highlight your point that Godzilla could not even be in the movie, you could just replace Godzilla with an American ship or a Russian ship or any, or just like it's just a guy with a bazooka. Like you could just replace it easily. And I think the brilliance of the movie is that it's able to have, you know, the city leveling Godzilla scene or the opening scene alongside this sort of PTSD, survivor's guilt stricken guy who ends up learning what it means to actually have sort of a worthy sacrifice for the people around you. Uh, and then, you know, because it's I think the success of the film is that he doesn't die at the end, and
Yeah.
that it all comes together. In that way, I think the movie this is most close to is Jaws, even though obviously Jaws doesn't have any analogy to war, and there's no PTSD in Jaws. But like a lot of the scenes are ripped straight from Jaws. A lot of the moments with the monster are basically like if you take out the city leveling scene, beat for beat, this is almost exactly Jaws. With the difference being like, the characters in Jaws are still willing to sacrifice themselves at the end.
Yeah.
It's just there's nothing set up about it. It's more just two dudes in a boat.
True. Yeah, and I think like Jaws, the original didn't really show the shark at all because the mechanical shark looked too ridiculous. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of a limitation on Jaws, whereas this one had a limited budget. And I think it's just kind of interesting seeing how the limitations mean that they don't show the monster as much and they focus more on the human element, telling a good story, which definitely appreciate and I think is a cool little overlap.
Yeah, and you can compare that to like the 2014 Godzilla movie
Is that the
with
one with
Bryan
Bryan
Cranston.
Cranston?
Yeah.
That one's so good until Bryan Cranston dies in like 30 minutes and then you don't care
Yeah.
about his son. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the thing is they tried to subvert the entire genre by, both killing the protagonist that is not only the more famous actor, but
Right.
you'd think it would sort of follow a standard plot, and they don't show a lot of Godzilla. So you don't really get much of either world, and then the story they tell is like a generic, it's like Twister. It could just be,
Yeah.
oh, there's a tornado outside, we got to look out.
I think if you're going to make a Godzilla movie and Bryan Cranston is going to be in it, you either need one or like both of them to have a lot of screen time. You can't like remove both of them and just be like, oh yeah, people are going to be bought in.
Yeah.
Like either
No,
Bryan Cranston needs to chew up the scene or Godzilla needs to chew up the city.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think I know it's a kind of a messed up takeaway, but I would have preferred Cranston's son dying and just had Cranston deal with it because you're already invested in Cranston from the start, and then the son comes in and you don't really care at that point because Cranston's dead.
From a writing perspective, that's how you get that emotional beat. You gotta kill off the son so that everyone gets more bought in.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, like, I've probably only seen a third of the total Godzilla movies just because there's like close to 40 of them. And I'm not like a huge Godzilla fetishist or like that big a fan of monster movie. I don't mean to like, denigrate your friend from Albany.
That's the first person I've ever met that is that level of obsessed with Godzilla, but god damn it if I'm not happy he was, because I would not have seen this movie otherwise.
I've been to a couple of horror conventions, and those are largely just based around people who are like, I call them fetishists. It's not meant to be mean, but I kind of think if you have like multiple rooms in your home dedicated to tiny figures from like one film franchise, you've kind of stepped over a line somewhere in your life that you're just like worshiping these. And
unless
even
it's Ocean's 12, in which case it's cool.
Ocean's 12 is the only acceptable one.
But these even at these horror conventions, there's always Godzilla enthusiasts who have, multiple copies of every VHS tape, and they're like, oh, this one, the dub, really way better than the original. And it's amazing that there's that much love for them. And I'm certain that they all view Godzilla Minus One as being the sort of pinnacle of the entire thing, because it takes the best elements from the newer American iterations and the best, war elements from the original iterations and combines them together seamlessly, where you have a great monster movie, a great period piece, a great war movie, and a very human drama at the center.
Yeah.
I think a huge reason for that, aside from the writing and the directing, is that the movie is explicitly and inherently Japanese. Like it's not an American or like a Western bastardization of this story. Like basically churned out over and over and over again to like Nolan said, not coming at anyone here who loves Godzilla movies or whatever. I don't want to get into Marvel movies either because that is a whole nother topic, but it also comes to mind when talking about huge fandoms with, you know, buildings and whole cities being leveled, right? Of just like spectacle. And I think that the way that this story is very grounded really comes across in that way, because if you ask like what's the intention of the movie, or what is this movie going for, I think like very clearly it is going for a strong message, a strong emotional response, while also paying homage to what came before, which is really hard to do, but it's able to pull that off because of obviously the entire team that goes into creating a movie. But I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that it is Japanese. And I mean, very clearly the understanding of Godzilla as a metaphor comes kind of full circle and comes across very strongly in this movie, more so I would say than a lot of other Godzilla movies, but also like other movies involving some external superhero, supernatural sort of element or force.
Yeah, and I think, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I think talking about like being an homage to the original movies, obviously, you know, Japan was leveled by 2 nuclear bombs, and then these come out, Godzilla comes out less than a decade later. Obviously, that's not a coincidence. But in the more modern tellings of Godzilla, I don't really remember PTSD being a major theme, kamikaze pilots being a major theme, and then like obviously nuclear weapons in the Cold War is a major theme. Like part of the reason that their troops and the weapons and the military and equipment that they have is so limited is because of US and Soviet pressure to keep a limited military. And then like Godzilla's heat ray, for instance, which he uses to level cities, I mean, it comes out as a mushroom cloud. And that's also no coincidence. Plus, they're following him with a micro Röntgen reader, which measures radioactivity, which just kind of drives home that point.
Yeah, to build off of that, actually, one of the story facts or movie facts that I was saving is the fact that I think this is only the second iteration of Godzilla that came out that shows Godzilla before it becomes radioactive. And it's just this really massive dinosaur, like a prehistoric creature. And then it's from the radiation that it becomes this all-powerful, like godlike force.
Atoll, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So because of that, I mean, if you can go with the Godzilla metaphor in many different ways, but as you mentioned, the bombs, like the United States or like the Western powers, however you want to couple them together, before they had the technology, they were very powerful, but then having this technology gave them this like ultra powerful capability of destruction. So very clearly, Godzilla movies in general is people trying to like sift through the destruction and the terror from this massive supernatural force that is raining hell upon a country.
Yeah.
And I think that's always what Godzilla has been about, whether people necessarily understand it or not. I certainly never really gave it much credence, just because I was always just like, oh, it's a Godzilla movie, it's a monster movie, like whatever. Obviously, as you get older, you kind of start to realize, metaphorically, what it might represent. But I think that this one, like, that really, really comes through because of that intentionality, that they chose to do it that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, one this is a completely separate topic. But I think the human element that helps set this apart and is sort of completely removed from all the monster elements of it is portraying Japanese soldiers who survived World War II, and not just in their reactions to having PTSD and survivor's guilt, but the way in which like they still want to help Japan, and the clear way that there were many Japanese people in Japan who were not a fan of the fascistic regime.
Yeah.
Because
sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was like, Shikishima shows from the start that he's all bought in, like he's willing to make sacrifices, he's willing to do what he can to help his country, his people. I mean, he adopts Akiko, he takes in Noriko. We can talk about like that in a bit, but like he shows from the beginning, yeah, maybe he's not willing to die, but he's willing to do what he can to help.
Well, it's something that I think helps. It helps with the popularity of the film for Western audiences to see that any country that we went to war with, obviously Japan has long been an ally of the U.S. Post-war. But it's not as if there are many movies that show the way in which there were people there that may not have agreed with the way in which the war was carried out, let alone, struggled with kamikaze fighting. And it's something that even in Japanese culture, and especially in Japanese cinema, has been very difficult for Japanese filmmakers to approach head on. They're very, like, the American film industry has just been constantly cranking out World War II movies. They make them like clockwork.
Yeah.
They make them in the Pacific theater. They make them in the European theater all the time. And some of them are quite good. Some of them are celebrated for good reason. But by and large, they're just like a propagandistic tool to remind people that we're the good guys and, anybody else is the bad guys. But for Japan, any attempt to speak about their embarrassment, because for the most part, that's become the way they view their role in World War II and their changeover from, their medieval eras and the death and the end of the shogunates into the, fascistic era. They've never found a good way to express it directly in war movies. And so Godzilla has been the most successful attempt to do that. Otherwise, they have to use abstractions. So they'll go through the same forms of brutality or governmental control, but they'll do them in the samurai movies. They'll do them in other period piece movies, and they try to, abstract it out through hundreds of years in the past to relate it. Or, they just go full on with science fiction and it's set in the future, and it's the reason a lot of animation from Japan is successful, and a reason I think a lot of Japanese films that Westerners are very familiar with deal with memory, repressed memory, hidden memories, because that's the core thing that sort of sits in the psyche of a lot of Japanese people, is that idea of repressed memory and embarrassment from a period of time that, the survivors are not really willing to think about, but the artists clearly are.
Yeah. Just to underscore that point, there's the doctor. He's one of the major characters. He's the one that devises Operation what's it called? Operation Watatsumi at the very end, which ultimately defeats Godzilla. But he's got like a monologue and where he kind of talks about that, and it's actually pretty direct and pretty blatant. But he says, this country has treated life far too cheaply. We've got fighter planes without ejection seats, kamikazes, etc. And then he says, I'd take pride in a citizen effort that sacrifices no lives at all. And emphasis on citizen versus government. That's a distinction that they make during the movie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can't speak with a lot of expertise on sort of the way that plays out in modern Japan. Like from my understanding, there's still a very heavy work culture, like the subculture of trying to balance people's personal lives with their work there is still very strained, and as a result, it leads to a lot of difficulties with mental health and people sort of fitting into society. And part of that, I think, is that sort of collective action effort is still not necessarily totally ubiquitous across all Japanese industries, particularly from the government, where I think bureaucrats and bureaucracies in general are still viewed not necessarily as like upper class or nobility, but in a similar way that they're like still slightly revered as much as, a successful industrialist or businessman might be. But moving on from that, since that has really nothing to do with this movie, I recommended for Reese to watch the Miyazaki movie The Wind Rises.
Yeah, Reese was telling me about that.
Have you seen it before?
No, I haven't, but it's Studio Ghibli, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right, yeah. I love all Studio Ghibli. I need to check it out then.
I also did not make it through Porco Rosso, or I never started it, I should say. Was unable to do that. Listen, last night we got a little crazy with St. Patrick's Day celebrations. I don't know what to tell you. Didn't get around to it.
Today's St. Patrick's Day?
Tomorrow is.
Oh.
Bill Burr took precedence. That's all I'll say. Yeah, but like that movie actually is like a nice sort of like cousin or like brother movie that pairs nicely with this one. It's an aeronautical engineer is the main character, and there is very much that like citizen effort to come together and make a difference. One of the beautiful aspects of the movie is that this aeronautical engineer is obviously in love with designing planes and just the love of flight. I won't say too much more about it than that, but a lot of it is like he wants to make these planes, but then like obviously like what are the planes being used for, right? So there's kind of like that aspect of you are trying to help your country, but then also you are a participant in war and death and killing, which is kind of just like the brutality of war in general. So bringing it back to this, within the context of this movie, you have a collection of main characters who are all kind of working together to try to fight this monster and defeat it. And in doing so, they are able to come together and devise a plan in order to do that. The other aspect, I mean, obviously, like we go into depth with movies on here and like just outright ruin the movie because we're talking about it. So in this movie, the big thing is that they come up with this plan, and Shikishima obviously is a kamikaze pilot, so the thing that he is going to have to do is to sacrifice himself. If you understand German, though, the plan or the plans that are outlined on the table, they literally show that this plane has an ejector seat in it. Yeah. So that's kind of like, I thought it was like a fake out actually with the title, with Godzilla Minus One. Like the minus one was that the main character had to sacrifice himself for the greater good of humanity. So I actually kind of liked that aspect, like playing with the title. I don't think it was necessarily even intended that way, but that was like how I was reading into it while watching it. But yeah, I mean, on that note, I was not expecting to watch a Godzilla movie and tear up.
Yeah.
I'll say that.
Yeah, I don't think anyone was, but it was a welcome surprise, that's for sure.
Definitely. Yeah.
Well, the emotion at the end to me didn't come through because of their collective action being successful. It comes through when they all salute Godzilla because, in the end, it still brings through this one thing that has not really been present in the film, which is a Japanese reverence for nature, which, is completely forgotten, untalked about due to their role in World War II. But like, it's an enormous part of Shinto belief and any part of their like religious tradition. And like, I don't know if that's true for you guys, if maybe you responded more emotionally to the actual sacrifice moment as opposed to them, saluting Godzilla and being like, shit, we killed this magnificent beast.
It was definitely twofold for me.
I think like what resonated with me the most emotionally was like you're talking about that ejector seat, but there's I guess starting back for people that haven't watched it, there's a mechanic named Tachibana on the original island Odo. He's the only other survivor from Godzilla's initial assault. Shikishima is told to get into his plane and use 20 millimeter rounds to take down Godzilla, who hasn't been radioactive yet. So it's Shikishima and Tachibana are the only survivors, and Tachibana is like, he looks down heavily on Shikishima. He knows that he didn't try to go to war, or he didn't want to fly the planes. He didn't want to do any of that. But anyways, Shikishima like hunts down Tachibana to make the new plane. And so this is what, Reese, you were talking about with the ejector seat. Tachibana actually is the one to install it. But Tachibana initially, he hates Shikishima. He wants him to die. And then they're having a conversation right before he takes off. And Shikishima like leafs through a notebook that he has. And Tachibana sees it's actually pictures of all the mechanics that were killed on Odo, the island. And he realizes like Shikishima never let go of what happened. He never let go of his cowardice. And they flash back later on to that conversation, but that's when he tells him about the ejector seat. And I think that's like, that part specifically resonated with me.
Yeah, and that is emphasized even further with the quote that you brought up from the I think it was the doctor that you said that I forget which one of you brought this up, but that like Japan is like needlessly sacrificing lives, and the fact that like I believe German planes had ejector seats and the Japanese did not, because I don't know if it was because they didn't have the technology or they viewed it as being more honorable that you were.
They had the technology. It was definitely twofold. One, it was the cultural way that they were, just tricking and I don't know what the word I'm looking for is, like behaviorally processing and getting these people to commit mass suicide together.
Nationalism.
So yeah. I mean, that's not quite the word I'm thinking. Conditioning. They're conditioning them over time to become peons and soldiers that will give their lives, because it's much easier that way. If you can convince a soldier to kill themselves for the honor of the nation, you can convince them to do anything.
Yeah.
Which they did consistently throughout the war. And the Germans had to do things a different way, which was, oh, you don't obey the orders? I mean, the Russians did the same thing. That the Japanese also did that, because, when you were ordered to kill yourself and you didn't, they would just shoot you and move on. But that's the brutality of war anyway. And but that element of it is like, they absolutely could have afforded to put in the ejector seats. They chose not to because it blends in with a lot of these other ideas. And it's not really a part of this movie, but the way in which samurai code, like Bushido and a lot of those ideologies from past eras of Japan, were repurposed and repackaged to fit the current model that allowed them to mass industrialize and mass mobilize to gear up towards a huge war that would, consume the entire east coast of Asia.
On that note as well, because Shikishima does not give in to that conditioning and actually succumbs to his humanity, like his human flaw of not taking his own life. It's that's kind of like what hits so hard about the movie, is that if he had actually gone down with his plane in the first assault and not ended up on Odo Island, he wouldn't be there at the end to then take out Godzilla. Like, yeah, they have other people who could have like tried to fly the plane, but it's kind of implied that he is like the dude, like he's the guy that has to do it, that's capable of doing it.
He's also a great pilot. Like, they use some exposition at the start, but talking about how he was able to land like nuts and bolts on a very narrow runway on the island.
Yeah, exactly. And they have that nice juxtaposition with him and that younger guy who is envious. He say it again.
The boy.
Yeah, he's
sorry, no, not the boy. The kid. That's his name.
Yeah, the kid.
Yeah.
On the boat, getting those like nice Jaws scenes in, but the kid is very envious that Shikishima was able to go off to war, and Shikishima's like, dude, like, or at least he doesn't really say anything, but it's another character actually who basically is like, dude, like, you don't want that, like that's not progress, and that's not something that you want for yourself. And I like that Shikishima doesn't really say anything. It's another character that adds that aspect to it. Yeah. On the other note of the war aspect, I think like the action towards the end of fighting off Godzilla was very resonant for me, but then also Noriko. I think it's like one of the final scenes when she asks him, "Is your war finally over?"
Yeah, I think it's the very end, like the last piece of dialogue.
Yeah, that was, oh man, that really, really hits hard, because it just really emphasizes the fact that like everyone involved in war has the external war happening, but then they also have this internal war that they're fighting against. And the PTSD aspect, that whatever you do in war lingers on, and creates this internal war that unfortunately a lot of people end up succumbing to, and their entire life is basically completely damaged after.
Yeah, just a piece of dialogue. I just wrote down like different dialogue that I liked, but there's a fake out scene. This is one that I was like, maybe a critique that I might have, the fake out scene with Noriko's death. It looks like she's going to die. She ends up in a hospital, but the characters all think she's dead. But the captain says, like, why didn't you marry Noriko yet, after she's assumed dead at the wake? And Shikishima says, don't you think I wanted to? I couldn't. My war isn't over yet. And then follows it up at the end of the movie where Noriko asks him, is your war finally over? Which I thought was just great closure.
Yeah, exactly. Just excellent writing. There's so many like fine details and fine points that are included that upon rewatch, I'm sure like kind of come through a lot more.
Yeah, definitely.
We touched on the United States a little bit within this movie. There are a couple sort of moments that infer the U.S. presence. Like there's one cut where U.S. soldiers are never openly shown in the movie, but after the time skip, there's 3 Japanese women wearing Western clothes, and they're like walking. I think they're smoking cigarettes.
Yeah.
And this is kind of like inferring the U.S. occupation, and most likely these women are sex workers who are like going to solicit U.S. soldiers there. So I really liked that the U.S. soldiers were never implicitly shown, but there's like that underlying like force of the U.S. being there.
I think like related for a Japanese audience, they would pick up on that a lot better than we would as well.
Exactly.
That's a good catch. I didn't think of that.
That comes from Screen Rant. I did not catch that. Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, I remember those women though being like, I guess the town that they're in, Ginza, is just absolutely destroyed after the fire bombings in World War II. And it like there's rubble everywhere, houses falling apart. And then you see these women all like dressed Western clothes, skirts, like fancy, smoking a cigarette. So it definitely stands out, but I didn't think of that connection though.
Mm-hmm. Is that Mickey?
Yeah. Yeah, he's hanging with Haley right now.
What other aspects of this movie did you guys want to discuss, or did you want to like kind of blend this with something else or compare it with something else?
I guess like the PTSD as a major theme and survivor's guilt. We've talked about it, but Shikishima was supposed to die. One of his lines, like very early in the movie, is I think he's talking to Noriko. I can't remember, but he like describes himself as, "I'm someone who wasn't supposed to live." He has like multiple dreams where he wakes up in the middle of the night, like sweating, panic attacks, and he's just dealing with like the weight of not dying as a kamikaze pilot, and then he's dealing with the weight of not jumping into his plane on Odo Island and trying to take out mini Godzilla with the 20 millimeters. And he's like the entire movie, he's motivated by that. And you can see like as the movie goes on, he wants to make the ultimate sacrifice, and that is his intention for all intents and purposes in that final Operation Watatsumi. He's planning on like not coming back, but he gets Akiko, the baby, who's handed to him along with Noriko, who, Akiko is not Noriko's baby. Again, I wrote down a ton of lines that I liked, but she said, like, Shikishima asks, like, "So you have no relation to that child?" And Noriko says, "Does it matter?" And it's just, I don't know. I think it's the idea of you choose who you want to sacrifice for, and it doesn't have to be blood. It doesn't have to be anything. Like in this case, she's a baby that was handed by Akiko's like dying mother handed her to Noriko, and as a result, Shikishima now has something to live for, and he has something to die for, and he has to wrestle with that.
Yeah, and then as you pointed out, the reason why he doesn't end up dying is because of this other guy recognizing the fact that he is still fighting this war, and everyone is fighting an internal war, and it does no good to sort of harbor resentment and wish someone else would die in the face of this incredible force.
Yeah.
Basically. Yeah, on that note, I also liked the fact that the drama that was in the movie itself was never done for drama's sake. Obviously, a movie of this length and a monster movie, you can't just have every scene just be Godzilla like rampaging. Otherwise, the audience gets no like reprieve. But we discussed this before, but the writing never felt like drama to me. It just felt very, I don't want to say matter of fact, but it just felt like very realistic given like the situations and how people would react under this pressure and in these social situations.
Yeah, I think like the last thing I want to talk about, but related to the writing, where it's very intentional and everything feels like it matters. Like it doesn't really feel like there's any wasted dialogue or any wasted scenes. But in Operation Wadatsumi, the doctor comes up with like a pretty intricate little plan, and the initial idea is to sink Godzilla using Freon gas into the depths of I forget what the trench is. It might just be Wadatsumi. So you initially sink Godzilla, and then the backup is to raise him very quickly with flotation devices to weaken him. Like the idea is to kill him with the power of the sea, which Nolan, that goes back to your idea talking about like the Japanese and the reverence for nature and the powers of nature. And like the idea is to kill Godzilla with the power of the sea. But this plan, Operation Wadatsumi, there's multiple like parts to it. So initially, of course, they're going to try and just sink him. And of course, like, going into a movie, that's not going to work. Like the first thing they do, they explain the plan, and like for some reason it's going to fail. The idea is to sink him and then raise him really quickly, and hopefully he'll be weakened by that. So they sink him, they're trying to raise him. He chews through the rafts. So all of a sudden the kid returns. The kid that wanted to be a warrior, he returns and he helps drag Godzilla out. And then once Godzilla like surfaces, then you have Shikishima more or less attempt. It's a initial fake out like kamikaze into Godzilla's mouth with a giant payload, like tons of weapons. And that's ultimately what kills him. But every single part of that plan mattered. Like it's not like it just failed. Every single part helped to weaken Godzilla. Like it just feels a little more realistic versus, all right, this failed, this failed, this failed. Now let's go with like our final plan, which we should have done from the beginning. No, you don't just have like the backup plan that ultimately was never going to fail. Every single part matters.
Well, the one guy, the boy showing up is like a Deus Ex Machina, but it's backed up by the fact that he and then all of the other like smaller fishing boats and personal crafts that show up are part of the collective action, and they're the people that initially were like, we're done with war, or we never participated in the first place. And so it brings together any of the loose threads from earlier in the film about the people who are tired of war, the people who didn't get their fill of war before, coming together and working into this. So like in, the most frustrating ways, a Deus Ex Machina is what can sort of ruin the reality of a science fiction or fantasy film, especially one that, feels as big and has the stakes that this one does. And that, like, I think so much of the credit has to go to the writer director Takashi Yamazaki, because obviously the screenplay and the script makes it feel like there's no thread that you can pull on to differentiate the parts from one another. And so to be able to blend functionally all these genres and have a drama narrative running through the whole thing that is about so many different characters and the different ways that they're thinking about and feeling a period in time that Japanese audiences, let alone American audiences, don't necessarily see this perspective from, and it's being done in a way that feels like a huge explosive action adventure movie on a really small, like a quite modest budget.
Right. Yeah. Nothing feels cheap, from like the set design to the writing, which is just a testament to the entire team.
It's almost like this collective action thing here works, huh? Like working like a team. It's huh.
Whoa. These are dangerous days, Nolan. You're going to want to keep that to yourself.
Oh, don't worry. I'll be in jail soon.
Yeah, I mean, down to the detail of the monster, though, like every time it appears, it never feels like they are avoiding showing Godzilla because they have budget constraints.
Yeah.
Like every time, like the backdrop of Nolan's screen is utterly terrifying, just fucking horrifying. And the detail of like every scale and like tooth makes you think that this is like a $300 million budget movie.
Yeah.
And I don't know
if you went
how.
into it, you'd think it was 300. Like you would. 15 million is insane.
I don't know how they were able to do it with that budget. Like I'd be interested to do a little bit more research on why they're able to do that
Yeah.
in this way, and like Marvel has to spend God knows.
Hollywood accounting, man.
Yeah.
Well, there are a few reasons. One, these actors were not paid as much. Two, the teams that were working on the VFX, like all of the animation, is an enormous team. Japan has much better ability to mobilize massive amounts of people to work on either hand-drawn animation, computer animation, the type of animation in this film.
Team,
Whereas
part of the ship, part of the crew.
Yes, I mean the downside to that is a lot of these are factories, and can be factories that overwork these animators and don't necessarily pay them well, which is like one downside of the way that the Japanese make films. But it highlights their ability to make one like this. Whereas in America, like the post-production budgets that end up ballooning and costing the Marvel movies hundreds of millions of dollars comes from all of the effects. So the effects alone will cost 100 million, and then it costs them another 100, 150, 200 million to market the thing. They're paying, Robert Downey Jr. makes like $50 million a movie. Like you could pay Robert Downey Jr. to say like, I'm Iron Man, like one time, or you could make 3 of these movies. That's the choice.
That is a really good point. And also I'd just like hammer home how good of a job they do. They won Best Visual Effects at the Academy Awards with that with that budget, and that's unheard of.
Yeah. I did mean to mention that right off the bat. I'm glad you mentioned that now.
Yeah, I thought it should have been nominated for Best International Film. It was a stacked list last year, but it's a monster movie, so it's not going to do as well with the critics. But I wish that they could have seen past that.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, thankfully, Godzilla Minus One won that award because it was up against some pretty mediocre opponents in the category.
Yeah.
But like, you're putting that up against other recent winners, which would be the 2 Dune movies, Tenet, Avatar 2. Like these are movies that spent, the amount that it costs to build major stretches of highway or massive buildings. And the Godzilla is just like, no, we just knew what we were doing.
$1 billion movies versus this.
Yeah.
We did not talk too much about the title, which, like, what does the title mean to you guys? Godzilla Minus One.
Well, we were talking before the podcast, or was it during the pod? I can't remember, but we were debating whether it was -1 or -0.
That was at the beginning, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it is -1. I don't. Nolan, do you have any ideas? I'm still trying to think about what that means. I mean, maybe should have looked it up beforehand, but
well, one thing I want to say is I thought Godzilla -0 was a different cut of the movie. I'm pretty sure Godzilla -0 is an actual form of release where they made it black and white because they wanted to make it like the OG. And so I'm pretty sure you can watch this on Netflix in both the colorized standard theatrical version and the black and white version, which I think they also released.
I bet this movie slaps in black and white. I bet it's fantastic.
Actually, it looks like I might be wrong because I'm seeing notes about this where it says like it's just Godzilla -1 minus color.
So. I kind of like that title even better.
Oh my god, Godzilla minus color. I mean, to me, like I already mentioned that I thought that like given that I'm an English teacher, like I spend way too much time thinking about intentionality of language. So especially with like a title. So as I'm watching it, I was playing around with like, why did they choose this? And I totally thought it was a fake out of, okay, this guy who is a kamikaze pilot who didn't commit the act then is going to sacrifice himself. And that's kind of going to be like the big thing of the movie. And the fact that they did something so much more with him as a character and with Godzilla made me think that maybe it was like that Godzilla is the minus one, like that he is being subtracted from the formula, which is odd because he's mentioned there, Godzilla minus one. But yeah, I don't know. I think to me it seems like you have to be willing, like the minus one aspect is you have to be willing to make a sacrifice for the greater good in order to defeat Godzilla, like whatever the monster is.
Yeah.
I haven't looked anything up about this, to be clear. Like I'm just completely postulating. So
Yeah, and it could
yeah,
have
we'll see.
cultural like a cultural reason that we just don't pick up on as well. Yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah, my interpretation was kind of like it's like instead of, you think of there's Godzilla 2, there's Godzilla 3, there's Godzilla 1, like as film series. So this is Godzilla minus one. This is taking it from the beginning and going in a different direction and going in a different perspective. Because all the other Godzilla, all the other kaiju movies that have ever been made don't address this perspective. Some of them touch on it here or there, but none of them are actually about the sum total human element of the destruction and that it's all a result of the war. Because as much as the first Godzilla movie, which I think is the only one that's even close to as good as this one, is able to use science fiction as an allegory for the, destruction of the nuclear bomb, the script is just nowhere near as good. Obviously, the goofy guy in the costume smashing the city, as awesome as that is for the 1950s, it's just I mean, look at this shit. Like you even compare the special effects of Godzilla in this movie to the Kraken from Pirates of the Caribbean 15 years ago, and this thing blows it out of the water. Like so many of those scenes just look totally computerized, whereas this thing looks like a real monster. Like there's times where my eyes started to roll into the back of my head and turn my brain off because it was just like the ship's falling over. Oh no. But I guess that's my interpretation of it, is like, an actual like numerical scheme meant to signify, hey, we have this amazing franchise and this great series and way to talk about a national tragedy and trauma. And, we're going backwards into it to think about it differently. I think you could be right. It could also just be, minus one, talking about how each individual matters. You can't minus one away. You can't treat life so meaninglessly while also having the idea of, an almost jingoistic ability to sacrifice yourself for the nation.
So I did look it up, but I do want to lean on our own sort of like as Art Fisher podcast. I would rather try to struggle with a title before resorting to Google. As I also instruct my AP Lit students to discover something for themselves before looking it up.
Give us the answer.
The answer, according to Google, Nolan, you were on the right track. But after the bombs in Japan, the devastation put the country at 0, right? So Japan is at like total 0, and so like Godzilla is now taking it to -1, basically.
I gotcha.
According to Daddy Google, but
I like my answer better. Fuck Google.
Yeah.
Death of the author / filmmaker.
Exactly.
That does actually make a lot of sense.
Yeah, like that's why. But like in subsequent episodes, like I would rather not look something up and then look it up and then like kind of do our due diligence for the audience to not force you to necessarily look it up yourself. Do we have any like final sort of points to make before we get out of here?
I mean, I guess I'll just summarize some of what I've said. Like, I like this movie not only because it's a great monster movie, a fun action movie that is in many ways a direct upgrade to one of my favorite films like Jaws. I mean, in taking some scenes just basically shot for shot and upgrading them from goofy shark effect from 50 years ago to, you know, the best monsters that you can make on a computer. Uh, its ability to work within a very well established, oftentimes very formulaic franchise and do something new is remarkable, while entirely changing the perspective and highlighting something different that I've only really seen done well in the works of Miyazaki, one of the other great still living contemporary Japanese filmmakers. But, his work being highly surreal and completely animated is, you know, much different than a war movie. I also wanted one other thing was to note that this did come out the same year as Oppenheimer
Mm-hmm.
and
Oh, yeah.
Miyazaki's latest movie, which is The Boy and the Heron. And it's fast. The Boy and the Heron, like all of Miyazaki's movies, has all of his themes, which is, grief, guilt, the surreal, fantastical escape from those things, which all stem from him growing up in the time period of this movie, directly after the war and during the war. Whereas Oppenheimer is, just the complete opposite take on nuclear weapons and the guy
Yeah.
who makes them and how it impacts him psychologically.
No, I think like Barbenheimer was a dope cultural phenomenon, but if you really want to watch like two movies that lead directly into each other, I like Oppenheimer and then Godzilla Minus One is like fantastic.
No, I was gonna say exactly the same thing. Cause like you obviously Oppenheimer ends on such a like, oh my God,
Yeah.
fuck, like such a dark note. And then this is, this ends on such a hopeful note, not only in the sort of revelry that it causes, like the yeah, but the reverence at the same time, which is sort of
Yeah.
a part of Oppenheimer in a different way.
Yeah, I guess if I have anything to add, it's whenever I watch this, I watch it in theaters with my mom, dad, brother, and sister, and they all loved it. And they are not all big monster movie fans. So highly recommend it. And anyone at all interested should check it out. Honestly, just watch the first 15 minutes and after, Noriko hands Shikishima Akiko and you're not still bought in, the movie's not for you, but you're not going to stop watching at that point.
Yeah, I think if you turn it off at that point, you have some larger questions to ask yourself. But
Yes.
yeah, I completely agree, and I'm really excited. Like I'm just in a space of excitement just from having talked through this movie, talking it through with you, because yeah, it really has a lasting effect, and I'm really looking forward to seeing it again. I remember seeing some post somewhere that had like the film poster for it, and I'm probably gonna have to get it and put it in my loft.
Oh,
In My wife will kill me, but getting like I've got some film posters that are must acquire, and I think that this movie is going to be a lasting film for so many different reasons. Not only just as like a tome sort of on the shelf with the other Godzilla movies, but as Nolan said, elevating what a monster movie can do. I think it stands as a testament of how to work within a genre and outside of a genre at the same time in order to like really drive home the intended messages for humanity. So yeah, that was Godzilla Minus One.
yeah, watch it.
For sure, for sure. I did not say that, but a strong recommendation. Yeah, a great movie. A truly, truly great movie. Till next time, everyone. Adios.